So what I wanted to do today is spend a few minutes talking about replacing the rear differential pinion bearings on a 2008 Kia Sorento. And this is probably applicable to some of the earlier, maybe later models that use a straight solid axle in the back. Now if you've done any research, you've been hearing a loud noise coming from the back and looked on the internet, you found a lot of people mentioning that the pinion bearings on these differentials tend to go out. And I can confirm that. When I took the differential apart and turned it, it just felt like there was some sand or something in there. It didn't turn very smoothly. So it is most definitely the pinion bearings. Now one of the problems you'll run into is getting a set of pinion bearings. If you look on O'Reilly or AutoZone or even Rock Auto, it's very unclear exactly which bearings you're supposed to get. Okay, now these are the pinion bearings that we pulled out. As you can see, they're two different sizes, but when you go out looking for the pinion bearings, it's pretty unclear. So the best option I found is to look on eBay, and you'll find a couple of people that sell a bearing kit for the rear differential on these Kias. And I bought one, and yes, those bearings were exactly the correct ones. They also come with the replacement front seal for the differential, so you can replace that at the same time you replace the bearing. Before I get into the details of how to replace these bearings, let's talk about the scope of the project. You know, what kind of a skill set do you need to pull one of these out and replace the bearings? And I would say that if you're comfortable replacing rear brake shoes and adjusting the brake shoes on a car, you could probably tackle this project. Part of that reason is because the parking brake on the Kia Sorento uses some small brake shoes, and so you got to be comfortable taking these out, putting them back in, and adjusting them. The other challenge with this project is with the pinion shaft itself. When I got this apart, I found that I could not remove this pinion shaft to work on the bearings, and you know, I used some fairly decent force. So you've got two options: either you got to have a hydraulic press so that you can push that shaft out, or you need to find a machine shop local that can do the job for you. I did the latter. I took it to a machine shop, and they even remarked that they had a hard time pressing that shaft out and putting it back in. These bearings, of course, on the shaft also are press fit, so really I don't think there's any way you're going to be able to do this at home. You're going to have to take it into a machine shop. First part is disconnecting the drive shaft. That's fairly easy. 4 bolts, there's a flange plate on the drive shaft itself that fits here, so you don't have to mess around with the U-joint or worry about the little cups falling out. You undo the 4 bolts, you take a piece of wire or a zip tie, you move the drive shaft up and out of your way, and you're ready to start on the next part. Okay, once you get the drive shaft removed, the next step is to remove this nut, which takes a 32mm socket. And you want to do this before you disconnect the parking brake, because you need to have this drive shaft, the pinion shaft, locked so you can twist on this nut and remove it. And there's normally the seal here that sits behind that. Take the anti-sway bar and move it up and out of your way, because the anti-sway bar comes across here, blocks access to these bolts, and also makes it difficult to remove the differential. It's easy to do. There's a bolt on each side that holds the hanger attached to the axle. You just remove the 2 bolts on each side, lift the anti-sway bar up, hold it out of the way with a zip tie or a piece of wire, and you're ready to continue. So, in order to take the differential out, you have to remove the rear axles. The trick there is getting these brake shoes disconnected from the parking brake. There's a cable that connects onto the bottom of the brake here that's going to keep you from pulling this axle out. So you need to get either some needle nose pliers or some type of a hook to be able to get in and grab the springs, remove those, and then remove the brake shoes. Once those are out of your way, there's 4 nuts on the back of the axle. It's that holds it in place. Once those 4 nuts are removed, it's very easy to take a rubber mallet, tap on the back of this, and pull this axle out. That will clear the differential for removing from the rear axle. Okay, now you're ready to take the differential out of the rear axle. The easy part is removing the bolts, pretty straightforward. The hard part is actually removing the differential from the housing. I spent over an hour trying to pull it out, turning it this way and that way, and then finally realized that I had to keep these bolt holes lined up perfectly and pull the differential straight out, and then it came out without any problem. So be aware that you can't twist this to the left or to the right in any fashion, otherwise it will not come out. So once you have the differential out, you basically have 2 parts. You have the differential itself with the axle bearing carriers, and these are held in place by these brackets, basically kind of like a connecting rod on a car engine. So you can pop these out. Now if you buy the bearing kit, it will come with new bearings that go on here. Now when I looked at the bearings on my differential, I thought, ooh, that looks kind of loose. So I went ahead and pulled them off, which was a little bit of a job. I had to cut the bearing cage so I could get at the inner race cup, and then put a gear puller on it to pull those off. I used something like this to fit over there so I could put a gear puller over it. When I was all said and done, the new bearings weren't any better or any worse than the original bearings, so I wouldn't necessarily bother with replacing these, but it's up to you. So once you have this apart, this is your pinion shaft, and this is the part that's going to need to be pressed out. And as I stated earlier, very difficult to get that shaft out, at least in the differential that I had. Even the machine shop commented that they had a hard time getting the shaft out and back in. So that is the basics of removing it. And of course putting it back together is just the reverse. So hopefully this video will save you some time and effort and give you a sense of the scope involved in working on the rear differential on your Kia. Alright, so I've finished installing the differential, and I've got a couple of other tips that I can offer you on installing the differential assembly. But before I get into that, let me just mention that if you're not too keen on messing with removing the bearings, putting in bearings, you can buy the entire differential assembly. Now the hard part is you're not going to find this at AutoZone or O'Reilly Auto Parts. You're going to have to go to the dealer, and from what I understand, it costs about $750, $800 for the unit. However, for this project I've spent about $400, roughly $200 for the bearings and $200 to have the differential pinion bearings pushed out, put on the shaft, and have the whole thing reassembled. So it's not necessarily a bad idea, and it'll certainly save time, because all you have to do is drop the old differential out, put the new differential in, and you're ready to go. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in removing the differential, you've got to keep it very straight and pull straight out to remove it. And putting it back in is even harder, partially because the differential is very heavy, and if you're like me and you're working underneath the vehicle on the floor, very difficult to lift it up, get underneath it, and then try and slip it in. I have a couple of suggestions to make on how to get the differential in place, lined up, and put back in the rear axle carrier. First thing is, on the differential, what you want to do is, in the top 2 bolts, you want to tie a rope and make a loop in it. Now, behind the differential, up near the rear tire, there is a crossbeam, and you can slip this rope across the crossbeam and have someone behind the vehicle pull on the rope and lift the differential. You have to get the differential up off the floor enough that you can get your arms underneath it and be able to maneuver it while simultaneously not trying to hold the entire weight in your hands. The second thing that will help is you need to go down to like Ace Hardware, someplace that carries some real bolts, and get some threaded rod. This is 8mm with 1.25 millimeter thread, and I would recommend you get at least 6 of these. And what you want to do is you want to put 2 on the left side, 2 on the right side, and then 2 at the very bottom. And you want to thread them in at slightly different depths, so that as you're lifting the carrier up and trying to push it onto these threaded rods, you're not trying to thread all 6 at the same time through the bolt hole, just 1 or 2 at a time until you get them, all 6 of them on there. Before you're ready to install the differential assembly back into the rear axle, you want to take and get some type of a sealer. Now, when I pulled it out, there was just a thin bead of some black material that went around the differential to seal it up. There's no gasket. So I went down to the auto parts store and looked at what they had and picked up this material that is oil resistant and is black, similar to what was on there before. And you want to put a medium sized bead all the way around the rear axle where the differential goes in, so that it's ready to seal up once you push the differential in. So once you've pushed the differential onto the threaded rods, then you want to take and put 3 nuts on 3 of the 6 rods. 1 on the left, 1 on the right, and 1 on the bottom. And you'll take a deep well socket and just work these nuts on evenly and just slowly push that differential into the rear axle carrier. Once you get the nut down about halfway, you've cleared the hardest part, and at that point you should be able to just push the differential into the rear axle. You can start putting in the bolts and removing the threaded rods, and then just slowly tightening all the way around, going around and making sure that they're evenly torqued. Okay, so to wrap up, if you're kind of wondering why I didn't go through step by step on the disassembly and reassembly of the differential, I was already done uninstalling the differential when I realized it would probably be a good idea to put together a short video, because when I went out to YouTube looking for a description on how to do this project, there was absolutely nothing. So at least this will help someone get an understanding of the scope of the project and the steps involved in pulling the differential out and putting a new one in, or rebuilding it and putting the differential back in.